Good evening. So we're going to be continuing a little bit of what we started last week, and I think we kind of pieced together pretty well. I was trying to decide, though, we should probably lay out where we're at. I've been wanting to do, it's not really out of the book, because the book is itself from a first-person perspective of someone's conversion experience, kind of highlighting a few things in it, but more the interactions that happen in it, of a book that came out several years ago, Muscle and Shovel, by Michael Schenck. And we covered the introduction and kind of the first 3 chapters last week. Trying to get about 3 in per session. This will be the second one for the month, and then we'll have singing and such, and we'll come back. But we kind of left off with, he's laying out his conversion experience back in the 80s. And his history, in as much as he really is church, for lack of a better term, was saying the sinner's prayer at 8 years old at a particular Baptist revival. Now, last time I kind of focused on him and a coworker. I didn't really use many of the names, but that can get confusing because there's other ones that will be running around, so he uses the names. His name is going to be Mike or Michael, and there's Randall, who is, I'm going to put it in those terms, he's the member of the church who's been working with him. So him and Randall. There are a couple others that will enter into the play that will kind of get in the way. What it left it with last time, Randall had developed a relationship with him. We talked about that a little bit. He didn't just leap on him immediately. He was a coworker at the place. He demonstrated a particular attitude that differed from the other coworkers, if you remember. And it was that he had joy in his life. He enjoyed what he did, or at least he had an outlook that chose to enjoy what he did. Sometimes with work that can be one way or the other. But he had a positive perspective on things. And he had a genuineness about himself, which developed in the relationship. So when he was talking about spiritual things, it didn't come out of left field. It didn't come as some sort of jarring thing. And he confronted him before Thanksgiving break over salvation. And this led to kind of an exchange. But we left with the thing that Michael is asking his wife, what is the gospel? And they can't really define what that is. Well, as we move into the 4th chapter, 5th chapter is longer, and 4th and 6th are a little shorter. We start having this first conflict that happens. And he begins it, and again, I'm not going to get the whole nth degree. Read the book. But I'm trying to draw out some of the elements and how things interact with. He asked the question, was I religious? Which is interesting. He asked that of himself. And then I thought, well, how many people react to that kind of question? What does that even mean? Maybe we compare, because you have 2 different forms here. The biblical definition of pure and undefiled religion would be what? Like James says, the visiting of, caring for orphans and widows and visiting those in need. And it's not that it's limited to that, but it's talking about the attitude of serving others before self. What would the world say is, meant by religious?
The connotation right now from most of the world religion is a bad thing because it kind of oversteps and imposes in a way that's not correct.
Okay.
And if you look at history, it has. You look at Catholicism and the transition, Protestantism, and even the Anglican Church and all these things. There's this oversight,
Excuse me.
Imposing will that kind of dominates instead of allows you to actually be as God designed religious.
Okay, and historically, since the 1st century even, it has been more common to have a state religion than not, which has its own issues, things imposed from on high, and they still exist in differing forms. So it kind of has a negative taste. But here's the thing: being religious, is that limited to organized religion or anything faith-based? I think people get religious about a lot of various things that they wouldn't call a faith. They can worship science, they can worship a cause, they can worship themselves. In his case, he's just talking about maybe the world's perspective of just someone that wears it on their sleeve, which is seen as a negative, although if you're supposed to wear the name, that's there. The way he put it is that he says, I wore the name Christian, Christ was not in my everyday life. Of course, that was from his Baptist understanding, but think about that. He wore a name that wasn't in his everyday life. Does that make sense? No, but that's the norm. And sometimes, I guess, it's an honest assessment. Again, we're getting into the mind of someone on the other side of the table, as it were, if you're trying to study with them, which is a nice thing, because sometimes we can have a perspective and a thought that's, well, of course, our understanding of serving Christ, or should be, is serving Christ, wearing his name, walking that path. But other people's understanding of those things get very different. You learn this really fast door knocking. People will try to prove themselves to you at the door about things, because and the lengths they go to are kind of funny sometimes, because they think they're like, well, I have a Bible that's on my kitchen table, okay, or your coffee table. Okay, you read it? Well, it's been in the family for generations, okay. The standards differ. He was talking about, again, he wore a name, it wasn't in his life, and he uses this phrase, being saved, quote unquote, was like a fire insurance policy with a one-time premium. He did this one thing one time, and you're set, and you're just kind of pushing it off into the future. Talking about that he had kind of a wild life in the 80s. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but that he wanted the finer things in life. Him and his wife wanted the fast cars, the big house, all the success. He wanted to be big in Silicon Valley at some point, even though he was in Tennessee. I don't know. He wanted, God's program didn't fit into my program, is the way he puts it. You had this separation of values, because religion is something you take and you put into a little piece of your life and you just kind of hide away. That's the way the world looks at it, as opposed to your faith and who you are defining your characteristic. And he was seeing that in Randall, and it was very different. Randall didn't even have to say anything yet, and he understood something. This question is coming up, and that's good, right? Put ourselves into Randall's shoes. Do we have an example that's good enough or close enough that people would notice something is different? No, that's more rhetorical. Let's see, I'm trying to go through everything that was there. There's little side things I took notes about. I don't know why he brought this little detail up. It might come up later. The CEO was announcing his son Ledger, that's a great name, was going to take over the company, had no experience, so it was kind of bewildering his ambition. He thought he'd become the CEO and take over the whole thing, and he finds out it's not how it's going to work. But in the midst of this, Randall will catch him at a certain point, and he asks him a question. Now, I don't know the whole interchange and all that they've talked about. He focuses on this, and I think it gets back to that he explained, when we talked about last week, that at 8 years old, he went to a revival. His third grade teacher walked him up front, had him say a prayer, and that's why he said he was saved. So Randall asks him, do you need to be baptized to be saved? Good question, right? Now, as we were talking this morning in the sermon, there has to be something behind that to explain some of that, but I would imagine there's more, But how do I put it in these terms? Could he have approached that in a way that was worse, perhaps? Well, you're like, oh yeah, well, what do you think?
Well, I mean, all of our, the history of the Church of Christ was, if you haven't been baptized, you're not going to heaven. And so, the statement of, if you've not been baptized, the more of the accusation, the criticism, instead of the open-ended
Question.
So there are times that we've used baptism kind of like a hammer.
Yeah.
And mistreated people when we really should be exposing them to God's word and letting God's word speak.
All right. So he could have been accusatory. He could have made a flat statement. He could have been a different form. Instead, he asks the question. He's emulating someone. Did you get that? Jesus used the didactic method a lot of the time in his approach to teaching. He asks a lot of questions. Sometimes he uses parable as well, but that also that invites you to seek out what he's talking about. He wants discovery, right? And I don't know if that's exactly why, but in this case, Randall, I think, did well to ask it. There would be a very strong temptation there to jump on him and say, you know, even with the best intentions, you know, you're wrong. He just asks him the question, and he gets a reply. Mike says no, because that's not what he'd been taught. No, it's not required. And so then he hands him a little piece of yellow scratch paper. Says, take a look at this. Because they were in the midst of an interaction. They didn't have a whole bunch of time, but he was just giving us because he's heading out on a service call. He takes the piece of paper, and on it is 1 Peter 3:21, which in the New American Standard, corresponding to that, baptism now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The greater context is Peter is giving a salvation example of Noah being saved through water, not that water's magic, but, you know, and you also have, Paul uses the Israelites passing through the Red Sea as a similar, you know, idea. He gives them that. Now, the problem, he goes on the service call, he has it with him, he gets that done. It's still sitting there because he can't get rid of it. It's just sitting there. It's sitting in his car. He can't look it up because he doesn't have a Bible. Now, he will end up getting one, but that might be something that was an unfair assumption. And I'm not trying to be, you know, when you give someone a Bible verse, do they know what it is? In this case, in this context, the history, he knew that it was a Bible verse, but to kind of go with how far things have changed in a generation, this may not even work at this point, because if you were to stop someone on the street and just say, you know, Acts 2:38, 1 Peter 3:21, and again, you don't want to abuse context and just throw stuff around, that's going to come up, would they even know what you're talking about? So how do you alleviate that problem?
It comes back to they have to believe the Bible is God's word. Of course, their common ground, Mike and Randall, is that Mike professes to be a Christian.
Okay.
And so he professes to have a belief
Mm-hmm.
that is based on biblical principles. That conduit gives them the privilege of having this discussion. Whereas a random person on the street, you don't have
that context.
You don't have a common ground context.
So say someone doesn't know what you mean, but they want to, then what can you do? Show them, gift them a Bible.
In today's society, in 2024, there's so many Bibles available on the phone.
That's true.
You know, that look it up and you can Google the scripture.
That's true.
50 billion.
A lot of times people don't know even that. That's why, and I have more than I need in my library, but for a while I was getting gift Bibles in every translation I could. Not because I necessarily wanted a contemporary English version or a New Century version, or these, but in case I ran into someone who had one, I could use the same one they had to start so they don't feel like I'm leaping on them to change it at first. It's also good to get sometimes pairs. Matching ones, because if they don't have one, you can give it to them, and then they can turn to a page number that's going to match between them, because they may not know where 1 Peter is. But they can find page 321 or 275 or whatever if they both match. And those are just ideas for trying to remove barriers here. In this case, the barrier, you know, he wants him to find this, and he actually wants him to seek it himself. He's kind of laying a breadcrumb out for him to find something because he's confident in something. And when someone is confident in something, and especially when they're wrong, it can be a very difficult and shocking thing to burst that bubble. It helps for them to discover it on their own. When he goes on this call, he returns. There's another coworker named Larry, and he kind of is on the scene just enough because he happens to have a Bible that he carries with him. I think he's going to become more important later, but he, at this point, he's able to borrow Larry's Bible, and he looks it up. And he comes to a conclusion that says, corresponding, baptism now saves you. I mean, that's a pretty interesting phrase, and that's the way the New American Standard works. I don't know which versions they were using. It seems the book is pulling a lot from King James and New King James, which is fine. It fits, actually, the realm, especially the area. So he gets upset about this because he reads that as baptism being a work. And we're not saved by works, so he decides to do the next best thing. He needs to find a religious expert. So what does he do? He goes to his pastor. Which sets up the 5th chapter. Now we're moving into December, but his wheels are spinning. There's already a question going on there. Randall at least has gotten him asking questions, and that's good, right? He hasn't alienated him. He's tried his best to demonstrate patience and love. There's something there to be emulated in that form. Now he goes to the pastor says, quote, "Don't worry about it," and says it's taken out of context. Okay. Well, if you want to say that the greater context involves salvation examples in Noah, still it's not taken out of context. It's salvation example, because corresponding to that, what that said, this, it's there. But then he has him go to Ephesians 2, 8, and 9. Ephesians 2, 8, and 9. Just a quick jump here. It's the simplest. Which they hold on to very heavily. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourself, it is the gift of God, not as a result of works, that no one may boast. Which, of course, Paul is using works in a very different way than James, and in a very different form, and he is focusing on some certain things. But it's, faith. You're saved through faith, not through baptism. See, it's a very simplistic approach to the whole thing. And he makes this comment that Baptists believe baptism has nothing to do with salvation, which seems kind of ironic given their name. I don't know. That's just, there's weird history with that. And he thought he was now an expert because he went to his pastor and got an answer. Okay? You can go to people that you trust, but again, human beings are fallible, and bad information breeds bad conclusions, right? But this is what he goes with. So he's ready for a duel. That's the big setup of chapter 5. He's going to duel with Randall. He's like, I got him now. Is this a bad thing? I've seen people shake that. What? Okay. How is it a start? Well, I mean, he's challenging him. That's bad. We might be put. I've seen people shake their heads. Why not?
At least the communication's going on.
Okay. Piqued his curiosity. Okay. He's seeking some different things. What are we told? Be ready to give a ready answer to every challenge. I mean, this isn't quite the same, but I think it's kind of in that realm, really.
Define your terms. Works versus works.
Okay.
James versus Paul.
Well, and I think it's gonna dig into more of that. I'm looking more at the interpersonal reactions here too, because again, we have our brother. I'm not saying he's gonna be a perfect example. No one would be, but he's a good example so far. But now we have this drama going on.
So to be clear, I mean, I've always said, and this is me, more Bible study has been done to prove a point than to perceive what God really wants.
Okay.
However, the Bible is concrete. So no matter how much study you do, the Bible's going to be pure. And you're going to find truth in God's Word, even if you're looking for something different, if you're truly seeking.
If you're truly seeking, and that's going to be your key element, because a lot of study has been done to prove bad points because you're just looking for the proofs you need. And is that limited to our time and age or the generations before? The Jewish rabbis were famous for doing that for years. They would quote this rabbi expert, quote this, and they would take the law and twist it into all kinds of things. There are a few examples in the New Testament where Jesus was banging up against them over their traditions they had built, over the law being pretty clear if you just read it. I mean, they created their whole system of, honor your father and mother, but oh no, if I take this, I gift it to the temple, or it's been gifted to God, then I don't have to take care of my parents because I'm now poor. It was money laundering. It was this whole mess of things. Well, he goes to him. He is geared up, going into work that day. He actually ends up talking with Randall longer than he plans and gets paged because he's not at his desk. Randall is like, okay. And he has to know this is coming. He gave him something to look at. He comes and says, well, He accuses him of taking 1 Peter out of context, which is what his pastor told him, and then he goes to Ephesians 2 and talks about how it says it says, I'm saved through faith, saved by faith, not of ourselves, as the gift of God. Of course, you need to include the by grace you've been saved through faith, and there's a whole other aspect and elements that go into that. The way Randall responded to this, I think, is very important. He could have responded with a pushback, an immediate one. What he does instead, and he does this on his feet, apparently, he highlights where Mike is correct. First, well, you're right. Ephesians 2, 8 and 9 does say that we're saved by faith. Of course, we have to understand what that means. He branches there, but he finds a common ground with them. He encourages him. He says, and it's wonderful that you're studying your Bible. You're digging in. He doesn't know that Mike had gone to the pastor to find this. He could have found this himself, but you're studying, you're looking at it. Then he goes on to explain a little bit more. He was to explain that baptism is not a work. Now, the thing that Mike writes in the book is that I was ready for a fight. Where was the fight? I was ready to yell and kick and scream and prove him wrong. And he didn't. He didn't back down. He didn't, give in. But he de-escalated. And then he went on to explain the context of Ephesians 2. Now, this might seem like a very minor thing, but this is the text that the pastor had given him. Oh, read this. And he said, well, this is what the whole thing's about. It's about Jews and Gentiles in Ephesus that were dealing with the Jewish Christians bringing in old practices and claiming they were better based on works-based things. And I don't know how you explain this to someone that doesn't have all of that background, but very simply was stating that they were trying to make all these physical things, circumcision, binding circumcision, and so forth, which is a work, into a salvation-based thing, and it wasn't. And that's the emphasis, and he lays it out how the chapter goes together. Now, the details of Ephesians 2 are important. I'm not going to try to take away from the New Testament. What was important in this interaction is it confused Mike. You know why it confused him? He was usually used, and this is something, if we're not careful, we can do too. He brought him back a verse to look at, in essence, a context. It's like, I gave you 1 Peter 3. He comes back with Ephesians 2. Okay. Instead of then immediately jumping to 20 other different references to prove a point, he stayed in the one he was given and explained it to him back. He gave him the context. He had never read all of Ephesians 2 in his life. You see why that's important? What was he establishing?
Like Philip and the eunuch.
Okay. How well does that fit?
Right where he was.
Where he was at. He was reading from the scroll of Isaiah. Of course, he didn't have a whole lot else to read from, but it doesn't mean he couldn't share the things. He met him where he was at. It might seem subtle, but from his perspective, he writes here in the book pretty heavily that this shocked him. Where was the fight, and how did he put it?
That's something I think is very interesting to note, that he didn't defend himself in the first Peter 3 scripture. He didn't fight back as a defense.
He used
took him where he was.
and now he didn't just stay there. Okay, he will go to some other references, but he starts there. He says, "Let's explain what you're talking about first. Let's look at this together and tell you the whole." And he says, "I hate to say it, but you've been given this out of context. And here's the context. It's one thing to say something's out of context, and it's like, well, okay. And I mean, we do it sometimes when we're not careful. But to know it and to explain it, that's a thing." And he says, here's the thing. Paul was writing to these Christians in Ephesus because they were so enamored with these acts of the flesh that they were in danger of losing their salvation. They could fall from grace. And he quotes from Galatians 5. And then he points out that there's only one place in the Bible where the phrase faith alone or faith only appears. And that's actually in James show me your faith alone without works, and I'll show you with my works, which really offends a bunch of people to the reason that Martin Luther had them rip it out of the book. They don't like it. And then he also said that the devils, which would be very King James, or the demons believe. Does that mean that they're saved? And there's those things to bring up. But he started where he was at. And he says, religious people, this is the way he put it, religious people, he used that term again, religious people seldom deal with the passage in front of them, instead arguing something elsewhere. I wonder how true that is. But it's really tempting, isn't it?
I've got my script, don't get me off of it.
Yeah? Do we have scripts in the church sometimes? I don't want to beat up on some tools that have been used in the past that have been very effective with specific audiences, but they don't necessarily age well with the various generations. A more cynical generation knows you are leading them to a conclusion, even if it's the correct one. And I would argue that if you have a study that's leading to a conclusion without any thought, you're not teaching. You gotta be careful with that. But I don't know.
Do you throw them a lifeline right then, or do you teach them how to build a boat?
Here's the thing, it's going to depend on the scenario and it's going to depend on the person, but that's true.
What do they need right then? What was the question they were asked? What's the subject matter? We're getting into the weeds now.
It's true. And that's how Christ answered a lot of questions with things there. Sometimes he would answer what they were really asking, but he has the advantage of knowing the hearts of man. We can't do that. We can't read minds. Occasionally he'll answer a question with a question when he knows that they're after something, and that can be effective too. Well, if that's true, then is this true? And that gets into logic. If your conclusion is X, then Y has to be true. See, because Mike, in his commentary, he's already coming to some certain conclusions in his head that aren't jiving. It's like baptism's a work, they tell him, and we're not saved by works, therefore, ergo, it's thing. But he's coming to this understanding, he's like, wait a minute, because he makes a comment at this point. The sinner's prayer, which you won't find in the Bible, but it's an action, couldn't you argue it's also a work by that same standard? It's something you do. And he's starting to go, wait, there's something going on here. Randall leaves him with he actually references 2 Peter 3:16, which is referencing the works of Paul and the idea that some things are more difficult to understand. And he doesn't dig into the thing about, how Paul's writings versus Peter's writings are different things which people get hung up on. He is just, here, I'll read it so I can have the phrasing that he wanted. Speaking of these things in which some things are hard to understand, which the untaught and the unstable distort, as they also the rest of the scriptures to their own destruction. They distort or wrest, would be the King James, they wrestle with it. And he says, you just be very careful that if there are those out there that are unlearned or if you're not careful, you can fight with God. You can fight with the scriptures. You want to make sure you know what you're looking at. And he leaves them with that to think about. And that closes out the chapter. Do I want to wrestle with the scriptures? Okay. So we've had our interactions thus far. I've just run through it. What do we think? Did our brother answer things well? Was his attitude something to be better? That's an open question. It's not like a right or wrong thing. Here, everyone's looking at me like, oh, I don't know. If I say one thing or another, I'm going to be in trouble. How would you respond? It is actually pretty frustrating, I will admit myself. And it's not just this phrase, but like someone gets one Bible verse that they just hang on to. I was like, Revelation 3. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. We talked about that one. Well, it's like contextually, that has nothing to do with salvation. That's actually the Yeah, the Laodicean church having put him out because they were making bad choices. You want to let him back in. Do you explain that to him? Do you jump all over that? What do you do?
Well, again, there's so many things that come to mind. I usually, me personally, try to take that concept of, Bible study. Who's doing speaking? Who are they speaking to? How do the people that were listening perceive it at the time? Where they are at, and try to look at the scope of that context where they were at. And I ask, when I'm talking, a lot of questions. What do you think this means? What do you think this is about? What do you think they're doing to you? So that they do the process. Because my goal is never to tell them. My goal is always to let them find.
Yeah, find on their own.
Because if they, it goes back to that, and something you alluded to a minute ago, some of the tools that were used decades ago were good tools. But they were so...
They assume a lot about
they
the
were
audience.
so scripted. And they led down a path that you could see where it was going quickly into it. And most people today become defensive.
Mhm.
I've mentioned in here the Isaac Stewart Open Bible Study. We were also part of the World Bible School.
Mhm.
And those lessons, they'll tell you, you go through the process of these lessons, at the end of the lessons, they will be baptized.
That's a pretty bold claim.
I know,
Well,
but that's what they say.
we had someone that was relative to someone in California that had a system of a flip chart that would give the entire thing, everything that you know in 20 minutes, right? Wasn't that the claim?
I think it was an hour, but
It was a flip chart. And it's like, that's dangerous.
Yeah, it is. Because, and again, I hate to do all the talking, but I always go back to Hebrews 5:12 that people process differently.
Yeah.
We have to respect them, instead of trying to make them see it our way.
Yeah.
And that's the hard part.
Well, and kind of going, and not to jump on my sermon again this morning, but it just as it came to mind, it's interesting what the materials assume the audience knows. Jewel Miller always got me, and I don't want to be on poor Jewel, but he would talk about the dispensations of time, like the Old Covenant, the New. It's like most denominations don't understand the difference between the Old and New Covenant anyway. They can't teach it to save their life. So bringing that up with someone who doesn't have a concept of who God is as creator is kind of wild. But there was a time when that meant more. Do you need to teach those things? Sure. At the beginning, maybe not so much. Okay, I'm going to play the con side of this little argument. I don't agree with it, but I just want to draw it out a little bit. You're talking about understanding the audience and where they're coming from. It could be stated, it's like, well, the truth is the truth. Truth is always right. And how we just say the truth, and if they accept it or not, then it doesn't matter. What they're coming from doesn't matter. Is there a biblical example of taking into consideration the audience?
A lot of the answers given that seem to be abbreviated take the audience into consideration. They had a question.
That's true.
The question was addressed, and it wasn't a full-blown umpteen jillion steps involved. They didn't teach the whole Bible in one answer.
That is true, which tends to then upset people when it's like, well, you see, you don't have all 5 of your steps in this one reference. Whatever. Well, I'll bring up Paul here. What does Paul say? He became all things to all men that he might save some. To the Jew, he became a Jew. To the Greek, a Greek. What does that mean? Does that mean he was a chameleon and that he was like completely unethical and lied? No. It meant that he thought about who he was talking to, and that guided what he was going to share. When he went to the synagogue, he would have had a very different interaction than when he went to the marketplace. And a classic difference, and it's two different men, but when you do a contrast between Pentecost with Peter and the Areopagus with Paul, they're very different sermons. Because Paul is dealing with an audience that doesn't even have a concept of God. He focuses on God as creator and the resurrection. That is all he talks about, because it's laying the groundwork for further conversations. Some of our brethren might criticize him for not giving the steps of salvation at the end of that sermon. But that wasn't it's knowing your audience. And so that's, not to inflate our brother here or anything, I'm just using him as kind of a means to discuss this kind of a thing of how you respond and where you start from, letting the other person answering their question. And sometimes there are things that derail. He's like, okay, let's write that down and come back to it. But meeting them where they're at can go a long way because it had an impact on it. Now, the problem is in chapter 6, things are going to get a little derailed. And it's not going to be because of Randall's doing. There's another character who's introduced. His name is Kirk. And he is a arrogant person. And he has definite opinions about Randall and the church. He had already told Mike to not hang out with this guy. He's bad news. And when he sees him, he then, gets mad at Randall for not listening to him, as if he's not a manager, he's not anyone in any position of authority, but he acts as such, apparently. And he basically starts going after Randall, and he going after Mike. He accuses Randall of being, he has a belief, that's how he puts it, he believes that everyone else is going to hell but those in his quote-unquote church.
The outsiders see it that way.
And Mike takes this badly. You have an outside influence that's a negative one that's picking away. And here's the thing. You can do everything the best you can, as perfectly as possible within our imperfection, and the world will still pick away. And wedges will be driven in. This raises Mike's hackles, as it were. He gets mad. He says, who believes such a thing? The cults, they're the types that believe such a thing. Okay. But he starts to have questions, because he has his inner monologue he's laying out there. These are things that he doesn't necessarily share at first, but this is what's going through his head. He's like, well, why are there so many churches? Why don't they agree? There's just one God and one Bible. And he comes to this central premise. It's interesting, he comes to it at this point in the line of reasoning while he's still upset at what Randall had to say. He has this premise. All denominations teach conflicting doctrines, therefore it isn't possible that all of them were biblically correct. And in a basis of pure logic, that is true. The term denomination, by definition, means something that is one subset of another. So they have to be in opposition to one another. If they weren't, they would all be the same.
Which is what Jesus prayed for in Gethsemane. They'd all be the same.
He prayed for it in John 17, too, that we would be like him and the Father, unified like him and the Father, of one mind. Paul wanted us to be of one mind when he wrote to the Philippians, because they had conflicts. When he wrote to the Corinthians, they had a mini denominational thing going on there. I'm of Cephas, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Christ. It's like, was Paul died for you and all these things? And we hit those things a lot of times when we're trying to deal with this concept. But not everyone understands that idea. One faith, one Lord, one baptism.
This is the danger of proof texting.
Yeah.
You can say anything you want. Just grab enough scriptures and throw them together.
The problem is this leads to a confrontation and a question. I want you to think about, how would you answer this? In his mind, he already has the logic down that not everyone can be correct if they're not on the same mind, but he still goes to Randall and he asks, do you believe that all denominations are going to hell? That's a weighted question. How would you answer that?
Define your terms. First question.
You really want him to define? He doesn't want to. He just wants a straight answer. Tell me now.
What do you mean denomination? Where do denominations come from? What does it mean, denomination? It means to name. And they're named because they're divided.
Okay.
Where did division come from? Satan.
Well, but then the counter argument is they divided from the Catholic Church, which is itself a form. Yeah, I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying that's the response you'll get. Though Catholic and Latin just means singular and universal, they just took that meaning to something else. If you want to mean in terms of just one universal church, the church, sure, but they put a big C on it and put a big hat on and change it to something else. The hat's important.
Being saved is not a denominational thing, it's an individual thing.
Okay. Well,
My answer comes from, Matthew, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it.
okay.
And so, within the scriptures, God's word, there is only one church. Now, in Franklin, Tennessee, there are probably 15 churches of Christ within 50 blocks of each other. And so, to say, well, the church of Christ is even divided
Yes.
because of man's disruptive force. But the concrete fact is that anybody that follows what is in the Bible, the teaching of God's word, is in fact, according to Acts 2, added to the
See,
church.
You're working it, and this is similar to the answer that he's going to give. You're working it from the inside out, as opposed to trying for the inception form of the church comes from X. And that's probably the best answer to say, okay, well, what does the New Testament say the church is? It is X. Now, does what Y is over here, is it the same as X? If not, come to your own conclusions. But are there any of those out there that might be tempted to just answer his question with a big affirmative yes?
Not anymore. Probably 30 years ago, but not anymore.
It's a very dangerous way to answer that question because it is not going to. First of all, again, it's in the hands of God. He is judge. The truth is pretty clear, and so it's one of those, you don't want to be on the wrong side of that equation, but to the temptation, he is trying to pin him to this statement is the problem. And there's a strong temptation to just get frustrated and say, yes! But it would be a mistake. That's what Kirk wanted to have happen. Doesn't like Randall and his group because he doesn't understand them. He's trying to set Mike up to fail. And some brethren with good intentions have taken the bait before, and it's not good. I'm being generic here, general here, but there's a temptation for that. Now, he answers with, well, the church is not a denomination, and it's not that simple. He puts it in terms of you can't just put it in this either-or way you're approaching it because they're not the same. It's not a denomination. So, he's trying to move it to a bigger discussion. He wants to set up a study, which I think is good. It's like, hey, they were in the middle of a task. He catches them in the middle of loading something or whatever and hits them with this. This is always when this happens, right? It's like, hey, how about I finish here? We can meet tonight or whatever, and we can discuss this better. But it's like, no, he wanted an answer right then. He says, no, I'm not the judge. God is. If you obeyed the gospel, God adds you to the church, adds you to the body. Now, does it have to have the exact name if it's a biblical name? Because if we're hung up on the name alone, then we've got a problem and we're behaving like they are. But I'm not the judge, God is. This is, and his is like, well, you're talking in circles. You're using circular logic. He wasn't, but he wanted that yay or nay. He wanted an up or down. Because if he went yes with it, that would have, in his mind, affirmed everything Kirk was telling him, and he would be angry. But if he said no, well, then why is he bringing up all this baptism nonsense anyway? It was a trap.
Some questions are a lie in the way they're worded.
That's true. But they're very hard to diffuse in the moment, and they require thought and a breath.
Like you say, I got to load this pallet or it's going to sit on my toes. I got to get this load out.
He presses him on, and this is what's going to end out the chapter and kind of finish us up. When pressed at it, he decided to go with, and this is actually the reference he used before, Acts 20 and 28. Now this is part of, I think it's Paul's farewell address to the Ephesian elders. Be on guard for yourselves and for all the flock among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers to shepherd the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. And focused on that the church is that which, God, the church of God, which is an acceptable name except for some use it and it gets confusing, the church of God was purchased by his Christ's blood. And he answers, any group that's not established by Christ or purchased by his blood isn't his. That's all he says. Does that lead to a particular conclusion? It does. But we're not the one making the judgment per se. But if he didn't purchase it and it wasn't with his blood, if it's not his church. It's something else. If it's something else, then what is it becomes the very important question, which can lead to some other study. That's where he landed when he was pressed. And I think it's pretty good given the circumstance. But he still wanted to study it further. The problem was, Mike was mad and ready to storm off. Now we'll see if he calms down. Spoilers, I think he does, because there's more in the book. But a seed was planted. Because he's already thinking in his head, this doesn't make sense.
So it occurred. There is no registered Jewish or Roman official name of the church in the Bible. All you have are descriptive phrases.
That is true. Including the way. That's what they were called in Antioch, I believe. The problem is if we were to call a group the way now, we'd sound like hippies. Well, I guess that's kind of an old reference. What would be the... Oh, man, hipsters doesn't even work anymore. That's like 15 years ago. It would sound odd. It wouldn't just roll. People would be like, yeah. It's a biblical name. Church of the Firstborn. Church of God. Church of Christ. Body of Christ. Assembly of God. Assembly of Christ. James actually uses the word synagogue instead of ecclesia to describe the church. Because it's a gathering together. So, Church of Christ works. Given just history, I like the Disciples of Christ name. I thought that was a really good one. Just because of the choices of humans, it was borne out that went a different direction. But it's a really good name because it's more focused upon fellowship of the group. But anyway, that's I'm not complaining. It's just unfortunate that that's the way things worked out, because that's a perfectly acceptable name too.
With the reference to ecclesia, fundamentally translated correctly into assembly. So to me, it seemed that if you're going to pick one that's closer than the others, the assembly of God is a closer reference, more specifically.
Possibly.
In its own way, but that doesn't.
Possibly. That's still an anglicization. Ecclesia literally means the called out. So we could be the called out of Christ, the called out of God. But that would, again, sound really strange, too, I guess, to modern ears. But it's what it means. Synagogue is closer to assembly than ecclesia is, actually, and those are all translated church. Ironically, and this is just a bonus, the guy who's the hostile one, Kirk, that's Gaelic for church, by the way. Kirk. Ironic. Anyway, that's kind of where I'm at. Any thoughts thus far? I know we're just kind of working our way through this thing, and we're going to have like a several-week break, so I'm going to try to refresh everyone and try to do another 3 chapters, but we're kind of moving our way through it. I'm trying to just have some discussion here, and hopefully that's been good. Any other thoughts?
What was the name of that book again?
Muscle and Shovel. Here. I'll just walk it up to you now. Oh no, I left the camera.
Thank you.
You can even get the ISBN if you want. Any other thoughts?
I was going to just add that, what you said about there's not one way that works with everybody. Each individual is different, and we have to trust the Holy Spirit's guidance to allow us to perceive what might work with each individual, and then have faith that if we mess it up, well, at least as long as we stay with Scripture, plant enough seed, that somebody else can fix what we messed up.
It's true. And again, it's about developing relationships rather than contacts. And every relationship begins with a contact. I'm not trying to beat up on that, but that's about how it works. So, any other thoughts? It's been a little different. Okay. Well, is there anyone that needs the Lord's Supper this evening? A chance. Okay. Anything else that need mentioned before we close? Oh, okay. I guess everything's just wrapping up cleanly. Okay. Well, if you would, just go with me and we'll close in prayer. Father, we thank you for this time we've had to look at a kind of frank description of one of your servants and how his conversion came about. Lord, help us to learn from the choices that are made, and also to spark our own selves in how we interact with others and how we present ourselves, that we present ourselves the way that you would have us and that Christ would have us, that we show him in our serving, in our consistency, in our demeanor, in our love, in our patience, all of those fruit of the Spirit and beyond, that we can be an influence to as many as possible. And Lord, that if they have questions, we have answers, and that we are ready to answer them, and that we're ready to ask questions of them and to share. Lord, we know that ultimately we are sharing a message. They have to make choice. Choice is theirs, but we ask that as this body, that we stay strong, encourage one another, and that we reflect your light as best we can, and that we seek to shine that light in all those opportunities that come our way, to make the most of every opportunity, as your servant Paul would say. Lord, we just thank you for times like this to study, to share, to discuss, free from harm. We aren't promised that. We thank you for it. Please be with us as we depart this place, back to our lives, that we remember that we're not just leaving here to go back into something. We're going into the world, but we're still yours. Keep us strong. Keep us spiritually healthy. Bring us back together if it be your will. It's in your Son's name we pray.